Okay, so the volume isn't wonderful. I'm going to try to just speak directly into the camera. Now, the issues that I'm talking about here I've brought up before, and I've made very similar videos to this, but hopefully each video will have slightly different angles or at least slightly different details. But the general idea is the same, and it's something I feel very strongly about. Um, and it kind of comes into a paradox situation for me because when it comes to China, I feel a real sense of contradiction. Now, what I mean by that is my own personal experience has overwhelmingly been positive, insofar as the two times that I've been to this country, I've had some very good, memorable experiences. I've found people, for the most part, to be very welcoming and friendly and helpful for that matter. I feel fortunate I get on very well with my colleagues. People have generally been very helpful. So a very small part of me has a slight sense of guilt, and I sometimes think, well, I have these very negative views and thoughts, but people are being welcoming, so that leaves me feeling a bit well. But then I remind myself that the issue here is not about people. It's not about um, it's not about how I regard individuals. It's about party ideology. It's about dictatorship, and it is about control. And if you come to China, you're an outsider, particularly if you come from a country that's not like China in terms of being a single party state. It's impossible to avoid the influence that the party has here. It's vast. It's very, very powerful. Can't escape it. So you get into this strange situation whereby people treat you well, they welcome you, they help you. That's what I've had, especially in Kylie. I mean, people here have been great. Um, and yet you always find yourself sort of self-censoring. Um, I've kind of been following in the background this dispute ongoing between China and Canada over the arrest of the Huawei founder and the subsequent detention of three Canadians. I try not to devote too much time to this because I know it will piss me off, to put it bluntly, the attitude that the CCP takes. Well, not surprising, they've turned round and accused China of hypocrisy and human rights, which is a joke, um, on the grounds that, their national has been arrested. Like I said before, she is going to have close ties to the party because you have to at that level in China. You cannot get to that level without having close ties to the party. So, in a sense, they're being defensive not because she's a Chinese citizen, but because she's one of their own. I don't know if she's a party member, but she will definitely have close ties to the party. So, they're being defensive about that. But I am beyond sick and tired of the arrogance of the CCP in always playing the victim. This is the same rhetoric they use every time, that of basically trying to turn Western tolerance against it. What I mean by that is a country like Canada, freedom of speech is deeply ingrained as a value, as it is in the United Kingdom, the United States, France, and other Western countries. And I think the Chinese regime knows this. So they use it to attack us because it's very difficult to say, um, we can't let you have your opinion because it's arrogant and disrespectful in someone else's country. It's difficult to legislate on something like that. So they use it against us. And when I say us, I'm talking collectively about the West. I am a Westerner and I feel that it is one of our biggest threats, this sort of manipulation that the CCP uses. I don't think it's necessarily our biggest threat. I think the three biggest threats facing the West is Russian state aggression, Islamist terrorism, and yes, I would say that Chinese state manipulation is third. I'm not sure if it's on level of the Russian thing, but those three problems collectively are, in my opinion, the three biggest threats facing the West. Um, and China takes a slightly different stance from Russia. I mean, ostensibly, let's take the UK-Sino relations. The situation at the moment is there's a golden age. So we have trade, we have full diplomatic relations, and it's much, much better on the surface than the situation with Russia because China hasn't tried to poison someone on our streets. But when China attacks Canada in this way, it's essentially attacking Britain, it's attacking America, it's attacking every Western value. And what I find sickening is the fact that they have the audacity to talk about hypocrisy. These are world professionals in hypocrisy. I mean, the Chinese Communist Party gets the gold medal in hypocrisy. They get the gold medal in sheer bloody arrogance. This is a party, to be clear, that has an iron grip on this country. An iron grip. You cannot escape that. And that's bad enough, but to then try to use these soft power techniques to try and manipulate overseas Chinese. Because what they do is they stir up nationalistic sentiments and they brainwash people for years by associating the party with the country. Therefore, if outsiders criticize the party, whether it be Western media outlets, whether it be Western governments, or if there's some situation with Western individuals, it's it becomes an attack on the party because they brainwash people to believe that criticizing the party is criticizing the country. Um, and the funny thing is, a lot of these nationalists will say, "Oh, we're not party members, or we're not this or that," but you can't escape it because in the Chinese education system, it is so deeply ingrained. People are taught from basically when they're little more than toddlers that the party can do no wrong, that all the problems that China has ever faced has been the fault of outsiders. You know, they remind people of the century of humiliation. They never talk about the 70 million dead under communism. They never talk about the Great Chinese Famine, which was the worst policy disaster in human history anywhere in the world, up to 40 million dead. And I find it utterly sickening that they hide that. As much as I dislike the Russian regime, even Russia is more honest about its past than China. I mean, in Russia, I saw a photograph the other day of Dmitry Medvedev visiting a shrine to the Holodomor famine. Now, I can understand Ukrainian sentiments, but I think even Russia has been a bit more honest about Stalin's brutality than China has been about Mao's. And it's an aspect of this country I can never be comfortable with because it is just so dishonest. And it's this toxic combination of nationalism and communism that is a lethal recipe because nationalism is a very powerful thing. It takes over people's minds and means that they cannot be objective. But there are a few simple facts to point out here. Westerners cannot protest in China; it's impossible. So if I see, for example, an anchor on CCTV, CGTN, making a rant about Westerners, it might piss me off. There's nothing I can do about it. I might be able to say something online, like if I get through the Great Firewall. I'm using YouTube, obviously, I'm using a VPN, but that's the only way you can express dissent. Now, by contrast, Chinese nationals in the West can freely protest. I think it's very arrogant, to behave that way in another country, to go to another country and fly the flag around. The only reason those protesters are backing her is because of the nationalistic sentiment. I don't think they care whether she's guilty or innocent. I think their only interest is, oh, she's a fellow Chinese, so we need to support her. And this is where nationalism comes in. It's incredibly arrogant. Um, but I think it's partly our own fault. And let me explain why. I think, simply put, the West is too tolerant. I think for too damn long we have accepted Chinese insults. For too damn long we have allowed them to play this narrative of victimhood. We're just too polite. We when we get into these situations, when do you ever hear Western government ministers use the same sort of language as the Chinese? I would like for once to see a British or Canadian government minister say something like, we understand what China's agenda is here and we're not going to tolerate it anymore. We demand an apology, just for once. I am so sick of the arrogance of the CCP. Now, the thing is, because it's ingrained in the education system, a lot of Chinese nationals can't think objectively. And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying they're stupid. But there is brainwashing going on, and that's not their fault. It's just what they're brought up with. So it's ingrained. They cannot think any other way. I mean, these can be intelligent people. These are people who often speak a pretty good level of English. They're smart people. But that one thing is so deeply ingrained that they're incapable of accepting any fault whatsoever with the regime. And it really pisses me off because it leads to this situation where we're basically being manipulated in our own house, to use a metaphor. It's like inviting someone into your house and letting them insult you to your face. That is what is happening with the West and China these days. And there's no equivalency whatsoever because Westerners don't have the freedom in China to criticize the party. They just don't. We're treated well in terms of being welcomed, in terms of people looking after us. There's no problems there, and I don't want to give the impression I've had a hard time. Far from it. Quite the opposite, in fact, in terms of how I've been welcomed. But I still feel like I'm shackled in what I can say. So it's bullshit. And it makes me very angry. But like I say, this is just the nature of communist regimes. They're arrogant, they're bullying in their nature, they're liars. This is what they are. It's what they do. Because the Communist Party cares about nothing except power. They have no values, they have no morality, they have no interest except absolute power. Absolute power. That's the only thing they care about. So this is why they're always scapegoating foreigners. This is why they look at situations like this to try and distract the Chinese people from problems in this country, of which there are many. Yes, it's true that millions have been lifted out of poverty, but there are some real social problems in this country which the communist regime, wants people to ignore. A few weeks ago, well, a few months ago now, a man drove into a crowd in the neighbouring province. At least 10 people were killed. Now, that's a serious problem. Things like that do happen here, but the party will order that local networks just hide it all. Now, I can understand if the issue is about, preventing rioting or something, but I find it utterly galling that they're extremely open when it comes to criticism of the West, when it comes to preaching and playing the victim. Like, we demand apologies. I am sick and tired of hearing the CCP regime demand apologies. They've never, ever, ever apologized for the millions of people they killed in China. This comes back to the video I made the other day about why communism doesn't get the same scrutiny as Nazism. Well, Nazism was an aggressive force, it invaded other countries. Communist regimes don't generally do that, so the vast majority of their victims are within the regime, within the country itself. So the vast majority of victims of Chinese communism have been within China. Therefore, the world just doesn't judge it the same. It's not that it's only Western countries that have a problem with China. There's many Asian countries who see China as a threat, and with good cause. But for too long, we've allowed them to play this narrative of victimhood, and I am sick. I am so sick of it. Um, so I really think we need to take a certain direction here. It's not about xenophobia. It's not about putting up the drawbridge to all Chinese people. I wouldn't want to see that happening because many Chinese students come to British universities with innocent reasons. They just want to study. And I don't want to see a situation where we don't get Chinese tourists or business people or whatever. I have no problem with those people. There's no xenophobia here, just like I've no problem with Russian individuals. But we have to see what's going on here. And I think that when Chinese nationals come to the UK, we need to make it very clear that they are guests. We will welcome them, we will treat them well, but they are ultimately guests. And if they come to Western countries and think that they can fly the Chinese flag around and demand respect and demand apologies, then we need to change the ball game here. We need to start basically getting tough and saying we're sick and tired of being insulted in our own backyard. I think the Chinese Communist Party has this warped sense of revenge because of what happened in the 1840s. So they cling to history, except selective history, of course. They ignore their own crimes, but they look at the Opium Wars. They look at, Western exploitation of China, and they use it to kind of get revenge. I think that's the way they think. It's very petty when you think about it. But make no mistake about it, this is a thuggish regime. Um, they may not be as openly blowhard as the Putin regime in Moscow, but that is Beijing's agenda. Now, people who haven't bothered listening will be tempted to think, oh, this guy is a hypocrite. He's in China. He's just saying how terrible things are. Not at all. There are many things I like about China. Like I said, I've had a pretty good experience myself, but I do feel shackled in what I can say. I mean, other than this, and this, the only reason I can use this is because I've got a VPN. But for the CCP regime to talk about hypocrisy, hypocrisy is Chinese nationalists who have been whipped up into a frenzy by the CCP coming onto YouTube, which is blocked in this country unless you have a VPN, to defend the party. I mean, how ironic. The party bans YouTube, and then nationalists use YouTube to defend the party. How stupid is that? How ironic is that? So that's the situation, and it's one thing I'll never be comfortable with and can never accept. Because if we continue to allow the Chinese government to do this, we're just being walked over, really. You know, China is a very powerful country, but it's not absolute power in world terms. There are limitations, and there's definitely limitations in terms of what it can do in the West. We can scrutinize Confucius institutes. We can make obligations on Chinese nationals to respect their host country, and most do, but when we see these sort of nationalistic outbursts, that is not respectful. We should not be tolerating that. And I think there should be some sort of disclaimer before they get a visa that they will not behave that way. I honestly believe it's come to that. Why the hell should we tolerate that if Westerners aren't allowed to do the same thing in China? So I think we need to start basically using their games. That's what it's come to. It's the only language a bully understands is force. So let's start fighting back. Let's start. Australia has woken up to this. Australia's made warnings about it. Canada, with all due respect to my Canadian friends, you're just too welcoming. You're too friendly. You need to you need to see what's going on here. Britain, there's all the Brexit issue. We're working out everything. Final point. This is in no way xenophobic. I know many decent, open-minded Chinese people, but that doesn't change the fact of what's happening here. And it's a very uncomfortable position for me. I'm not going to lie about that. I do feel between a rock and a hard place because I'm torn between affection for my friends and my own positive experience versus what I know to be happening and what I can see happening. And difficult position. This is not a subject I would bring up with my colleagues. It's not something that I'm going to say. I mean, some of them are in the party, and individually, they're decent people. They're intelligent. They're welcoming. They've been helpful. But as soon as it comes to anything political, I change the subject because if I do voice my own opinions, it's going to be a very awkward position because they're not going to say you're forbidden from doing it, but in China, you just can't express dissent. You can't without consequence. So it's really sad. I mean, we may be limited in terms of what happens in China because that's in China, but we can absolutely do a lot more in terms of relations, Sino-Western relations, and we could do a hell of a lot more in terms of how we approach this within our countries. That's what I find galling. And like I say, it's partly the fault of Western countries for being too soft. So when Trump talks about getting tough with China, I hope he's not just talking about trade. I hope he's also talking about this sort of so-called soft power techniques. Unfortunately, Trump is a very unstable character, and I don't particularly trust him to, unnecessarily defend the West in this regard. And I don't trust Mr. Trudeau either. I think Trudeau is too soft. So we need real leadership in the West. We need a Western leader who's not going to be afraid to say, no, we're not going to make apologies. We're not going to grovel to you. And we're going to be the ones demanding respect for once. We need to turn the tables on this because there's this mentality that Oh, there's 1.4 billion of us. That is this kind of mentality. We can do whatever we want. And I'm not talking about individual Chinese. I'm talking about the mantra that the party uses. And then some people lap it up. And like I say, they don't know any better because it's in the Chinese education system from a very young age. They are taught to love the party.